we started feeling more comfortable about hosting something in person. And I think there was this, at least in New York, this hunger to meet people again. And it was kind of this blank slate.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools, the show that investigates how dev tools go from 0 to 1. I'm joined today by Paul Butler, who is the co-founder of Drifting in Space, which is pushing the limits of browser technology, which is a very vague way of saying that they're doing some really cool stuff. And Paul, do you want to tell us a bit about what that cool stuff is?
Sure, yeah. And thanks for having me, Jack. So the genesis of what we're trying to do is we've seen, this movement of application software into the browser over the last decade plus. I guess you could kind of trace it back to database apps in the 2000s and Google Docs and that kind of thing in that era. And over time, we've seen more and more advanced applications being kind of shoved into the browser. Things like 3D editing, video editing, CAD software, geographic data manipulation, things like that. So what we're trying to do is address the pain points that come up when you're trying to run these applications that expect a heavyweight, maybe 32 gigabytes of memory, 64 gigs of memory, and they're trying to kind of push that down to WebAssembly where they get about 4 gigs in the best case scenario. So what we've kind of done is built a way for these browser-based applications to spin up what we think of as kind of a child process that runs on a remote machine, a server, and they get a low latency direct connection to that. They can send messages and split compute really between the two. We even have a way of doing remote rendering in that child process and then rendering that or sending that back as a compressed video back to the client and rendering it inside the application as a React component. So we've really been going after these problems of these pain points that emerge when these heavyweight kind of industrial scale applications come into the browser.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so, is it kind of, you're democratizing the ability to build like the next Figma in a way?
Yeah, we definitely took inspiration from Figma's architecture. They've been very generous in posting a lot of blog posts about what they've done, which was really, I think at the time, pretty pioneering in their architecture. We've seen similar architectures in things like GitHub Codespaces and other places where they talk about it a little bit less, but I guess because VS Code's open source, you kind of get a sense of it. Where we're kind of extending it is sort of taking the underlying infrastructure that Figma built and then adding this high compute component. So if you want to make the scheduler aware of how much memory, how much GPU capacity, CPU capacity each of these machines have, so that you could build an app that, for example, pulls down 10 gigabytes of data for each user. And obviously, you can't do that at Facebook scale, but you can do that on the scale of an internal app at a company that deals with large data, or an expensive SaaS app, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it could actually be like an even more powerful Figma.
Yeah, and maybe not. I think vector graphics editing, it's inherently a relatively computationally lightweight problem. So they can do a lot where they just compile stuff to WebAssembly and do it in the browser. That makes a lot of sense for something like Figma. It doesn't go all the way for something like a video editor or a 3D modeling tool where you may have more computationally heavyweight stuff to do there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, sorry, and I'm still like digging in just to make sure. So, you're saying that if someone were to build like a video, like a seriously computational video editor, they could do that in the browser if they're using plain.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Very, very cool and exciting. Yeah. And I like the way you talked about it offline, that the expectation is that browser apps kind of have to be a lot further behind desktop apps. And it seems like you're kind of bringing that kind of parity.
Yeah, I think there's been people have been excited about just being able to run stuff in the browser. And I think it's a really low friction experience that you can, open up a URL and be immersed in an application. And so I think for a while we've kind of put up with that type of application being janky and slow and less featureful. And I think what we've seen lately and what we're going to see over the next few years as technologies like web GPU, web transport, web codecs really take off is that will change. There will be more of a competition for performance instead of just the table stakes running in the browser piece.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that kind of brings us on to the main topic that we're going to talk about today, which is that you're kind of somewhere where you're kind of pushing the limits of like what's possible, and you've built this community of an in-person community called the Browser Tech Community.
Yeah, we started as Browser Tech New York, and now it's just Browser Tech because we did one in San Francisco as well, and we're actually looking at other cities too.
Amazing. And this is something that like we're kind of, especially after COVID, everything went online. It's like, how many Slack group communities are we all in? But actually like in person, I'm in a community in London, and it's just been incredible. And so I'd love to hear about like what it's been like to kind of organize that.
Yeah, so we started as a company kind of early 2022. So it was still, people were still wearing masks. It was still in-person events were still kind of frowned upon. Um, about I guess it was August, we started feeling more comfortable about hosting something in person, and I think there was this, at least in New York, this hunger to meet people again. And a lot of the meetups, pre-COVID meetups that people were hosting kind of ended. I think people just moved on. It's a lot of energy to organize these things. If they had corporate sponsorship, there was often changes, like turnover corporate in the company. So there's kind of harder to reboot that thing. So it was kind of this blank slate where there weren't a lot of these recurring meetups happening in New York, at least. And we also felt like where the browser-based development community had kind of gone in over the last couple of years during COVID, there was kind of this blank space where what we saw is kind of a bifurcation of web development, where on one hand you have people, building Next.js apps and Gatsby blogs and care about SEO and bundlers and that kind of thing, and then this other world of people who are more approaching application development as desktop application developers would. Their code bases were Rust that they're compiling to WebAssembly, and they're in some cases they were even avoiding the DOM and doing direct to GPU rendering. And so you got these applications that were, yes, they're running in the browser, but like, are the developers really identifying as web developers? They just happen to be deploying to the browser because the browser is kind of the new operating system. So we kind of looked at it from this angle of, if the browser is the new operating system, where are the people developing for this operating system, developing applications and pushing the limits of this operating system meeting? And we found that the traditional web development communities were not really that, or if they were that, they were kind of watered down by, SEO and other things that were not relevant to those developers. So we were interested just because we wanted to be in the same room as them. If this meetup existed, we would not have probably created it. But because we felt that there was a void there, we started meeting with some folks. We initially just kind of invited. We looked at who was building these applications in New York, invited everybody out for tacos, and Runway ML, who's building a video editor in the browser. When we asked them about it, they were like, we could host this. So we basically just got a bunch of takeout tacos and had tacos with a number of the other application developers in the city. And that was kind of when we realized that there was this core mass of people and that we should start doing kind of a more formal meetup with talks and things like that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Could I actually like ask like what kind of topics were people talking about on there? Like,
Yeah, so we've had talks on things like high performance with React. We had a talk from Runway actually where the talk was sort of about creative ML tools in the browser. Um, we've had a talk on scaling up DuckDB in the browser, and one of the coolest ones I think was talk from WAMP, which is a 3D editor that runs in the browser. And they actually do server-side pixel streaming down of GPU rendered content. So it's a really fascinating and I think really powerful architecture. So it was really interesting to see that one.
Yeah, amazing. And when you say like about being in the same room, you just wanted to be in the same room as people building, like kind of advanced tools for the browser. Like, what what do you think are the benefits of being in the same room?
I think there's a lot of these people building in different verticals or different types of software are, when we've found this kind of talking to a lot of these people when we were just trying to have customer conversations, we found that people were discovering the same things or having the same problems, and there wasn't really this means of knowledge sharing between those folks. Like, I think in some cases they'd have a company blog and maybe it'd get on Hacker News and the other people would see it, but there wasn't really this community the same way that in more mature communities like web development in general, like React community, Svelte community. I think in a lot of cases there are these online and offline communities where people are talking to each other about the tools that they use. When it came to kind of these raw, you know, just pushing the edge of these browser APIs. And we're kind of interested in like WebRTC, WebGL, basically all the web prefix technologies. So there were meetups for individual ones of those. Like there's some cities have WebAssembly meetups, some cities have WebGL meetups, but people kind of tackling this application building and using all of these APIs and just really trying to build advanced applications in the browser. That was where we kind of felt like there was this blank space.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's like people, it's less about the exact technology, but more like the goal that they're trying to reach.
Yeah, I would say it's less about. I mean, it sort of is. We're very interested in the surface area of the browser APIs. So the things that are and aren't possible in the browser are definitely on topic for us. But we're equally interested in kind of what people build on top of that. So the way that they build applications, the design choices that they make in doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of like drifting in space, how is like drifting in space's relationship with the community that you've built?
So we kind of, in building this community, I've kind of tried to keep the browser tech brand and community a little bit arm's length in that, we don't want people to see it and be like, oh, that's just drifting in space's megaphone. We kind of want to fill in the what we see as the blank space and build sort of a community where, um, we obviously benefit from having it. We kind of treat the meetups as a chance where we can demo some stuff as well. So we usually have a couple talks and then demo some stuff we're working on. And then I run a newsletter as well. So the newsletter occasionally mentions some stuff that we've been working on, but is also kind of independent in my voice anyway. I mean, obviously it's not independent. I'm writing it, but it's I try to kind of keep an independent voice with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's like a couple of ways that maybe it like does help with getting drifting in space out there amongst people that would be interested.
Mhm.
I could imagine it also like helps feed into like your product development stuff a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of this, I mean, I think one of the reasons that it's easier for me to do this newsletter and things is that I'm kind of just writing what I've already learned in the process of talking to a lot of customers, following what's going on in the industry. So I realized I was kind of already building up this base of knowledge in my head of what's happening in the browser right now and who's on the forefront of it and what they're doing and how they're doing it. So, like when we see a new app, we love to just like, especially collaborative apps, we'll sign up for the beta and run it in the office and play with it and talk about how they built things. And we have a lot of fun doing that. And I think there's other people who enjoy that type of content as well. Um, so yeah, one of the things that we like doing is just playing with new apps, and so writing about that comes very naturally to us.
That's really cool. So is that like a big part of what your content that you put out is about, just like kind of deconstructing like, oh, how did they build this?
Yeah, it tends not to be like in deconstructing individual apps, although I've kind of thought about going down that path a bit because I do think that's interesting. If uh, we don't want to alienate anybody, so with permission from the app developers. But what more of what we do is kind of looking at, because we kind of break down what these applications are doing, we do observe trends, and then we can write about those trends. So the last issue, for example, was about GPU rendered UIs. So these are applications that are talking directly to a GPU API like OpenGL or WebGL to render their entire UI. So these are apps that don't talk to the DOM at all, except to kind of create a canvas element and then get the context of the canvas element, and then basically render everything. We started to see this emerging pattern over the last few years and put it into a blog post.
Yeah, really cool. Really cool. Kind of actually stepping back a little bit, like we've got that you've like this amazing community that you've built, and it's like kind of a very targeted community. One of the things that two of our guests mentioned recently is that you have to be very sure of who your kind of persona or like your target customers. And it sounds like, first of all, that you are pretty sure on that. You're nodding your head. So,
Yeah.
um, how did you come to that place?
Yeah. So I think so I would define our customers as kind of people building really ambitious applications in the browser, people kind of pushing the edges of what's possible in the browser. And I think that really just comes from what the technology is. So I think of the technology as kind of a solution to the problem where you've hit the limit of what you can do in the browser itself. Either because you're dealing with so much data that you don't want to send it all over the wire down to the user. We were talking about like the video editing use case earlier. If you're trying to do 4K video, you might have gigabytes, many gigabytes, terabytes of data, depending on how much video content you're working with. Um, so you can't send that down to the browser, even if the browser could hold it. You have network problems. Another example of this is data visualizations with many points. Um, we have a demo recently where we'll load in a bunch of a gigantic point cloud, millions and millions of points, um, load it into the point that it chokes the browser, and then we can almost instantly switch to remote cloud rendering of that on a remote GPU, dedicated GPU machine, and streaming that back. So that type of thing, that doesn't. If you're building a blog site or building e-commerce or something like that, it's you know you're not the customer. But if you're building really ambitious desktop class applications, I almost think of it as like if you're building the type of application that if it were running on the browser, somebody would upgrade their RAM to run it. That's kind of the uh, the scope of what we're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess you've got like a nice advantage in some ways that it's not like a subtle difference. Like
Mhm.
I know like some agents that some companies struggle with like, are we like early stage people, kind of like medium, and yours is like if they're really doing something ambitious, very obvious if they need if they're like our target audience, it seems.
Yeah, and we find that they can sort of self-identify in many cases as well, where people sort of see, okay, I've got this use case, and I, you know, I thought of an infrastructure like this in my head, and I thought of all the things that I would need to build it, and thought it would be better if somebody else had built it, and then I found Plane, and then so it kind of goes from there sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, and then the other question I've got is like, at the moment, I think you're very focused on your open source projects. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're focusing a lot on open source. The way that it works with Plane and Jamsocket, so Plane is kind of our flagship open source project, um, and then Jamsocket is built on top of it. So Jamsocket's kind of a managed version of it, and it's really kind of a spectrum from completely using the managed product to completely using the open source product, where there's also an option in the middle, which is you can kind of run the worker nodes. You actually run the compute on your machines, but use our central control plane to coordinate it. Um, and that's kind of a nice middle ground where none of the data goes through us, none of the application data goes through us, only the coordination data and routing. And so we're kind of just taking care of the DNS and the certificates and orchestration, scheduling, that kind of thing on our end.
Super cool. So how are you like? kind of thinking about like getting customers that like how do people start paying you money? I guess is like does it go from like yeah
Yeah, so it's for we get paid for the infrastructure. So people running it open source. I mean, we maybe could negotiate a support contract, but in theory, they can do it without even talking to us. So the money comes from the managed side. It's kind of like any other usage based type thing for the completely managed side, and then in the middle where they're kind of running it as a control plane, it's more of a monthly fee. Um, and then fee per machine that they attach to it, kind of a Datadog model.
yeah nice like are these kind of individuals like it seems like it's kind of a it would be like a larger organization type of thing commonly.
It does tend to be. I think right now with the way the platform is, it's I mean it is fairly simple in the sense that the surface area is fairly small. Basically, you push a Docker container to us, and then instead of deploying it immediately, what you get is an API. And every time you hit the API, we send you back a host name that is a basically an ephemeral instance of the container that you spawned up. So the way that you kind of use that as a child process is from the browser, you can open a WebSocket connection to it. Obviously, whatever you're running in the container needs to have a WebSocket connection server built into it. So we're not prescriptive about what framework you're using inside the container. You could serve a WebSocket from a Node.js or Python or whatever, but you can connect to that from the client. When that connection goes away, if that's the only connection that exists to it, we will schedule that container to shut down. So it's kind of ephemeral, short lived, but well, we call it session lived. So it's like as long as the tab is open, we keep the process alive. To answer your question about kind of who's using this, we do find people kind of come in to poke around with it as individuals. Where we find larger companies kind of come in as typically at this point seed and series A kind of stage companies. So it tends to be people building new stuff or scaling stuff, kind of going from being able to run everything on one vertically scaled out machine to realizing that they need to add more machines, but kind of doing that naively, just putting that one machine they had behind a load balancer doesn't work anymore because they relied on having state in memory and things like that.
Okay, and then so they have like this pain, and is it like they remember like oh what if plane could help us with this or like how
Yeah,
do they
yeah. Often when we hear from people, it is like, okay, I saw Plane on GitHub or on Hacker News or something 6 months ago, and didn't think much of it at the time, but came around to this now, and I was like, oh wait, I've seen a solution to this problem, and they almost like have this moment of enlightenment where they're like, oh, that's what Plane was trying to do. Okay, yeah, I'll take a look now. So it is kind of a slow burn that way, because I think this is not. We've had to really create the vocabulary even around this problem. We call this a session backend when we do this, and when we spin up one of these processes that lives for the lifetime of a tab. But Figma was doing that. Codespaces was doing that. All these applications were already doing something like this. They just didn't really have a word for it. So we've had to really educate people about that architecture, and that's been slow. But when they get it, they get it.
yeah is there like any kind of things that you've learned from like having this where it's like a new concept um
Um, I would say so we decided, we wrote a blog post about it. We shared the blog post around. I think that's helped people. That's helped it click for people is sort of having these different approaches to it. There's kind of the explanation that you get if you look at Plain directly, which is a very technical explanation. There's the explanation you get if you read our blog post, and there's I've done other podcasts that you've heard. So yeah, there's sort of we're just trying to get out there and explain it in a bunch of different ways. We have talks that we've given in person, and then those are on YouTube. So, really, just trying to evangelize this concept and talk about it. And when we talk about it, we don't really push plain as the only solution. Like I think the best solution because we've been the first to kind of really address it head on as a problem. But there's other people kind of building their own infrastructure on this around Kubernetes and things like that. So we're just trying to get the word out about this problem and go from there.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Paul, that is what we've got time for. But we just started doing a takeaways section, very brief section of takeaways that you've got, either that we covered in the episode or that you think that other DevTool founders, early stage employees at DevTool should kind of take away from what you've learned.
So one, I had a hot take on Twitter this week, so I'll repeat that. It's that I think that if you're trying to break through on Hacker News, that a cookie banner is detrimental. And I had one of the founders of Y Combinator actually commented, and he was like, "Yeah, if I see something that has a cookie banner, like my bounce rate is 50% immediately." But my theory around this is a bit more intricate. It's not that the cookie banner is always detrimental. It's that it's detrimental when you have no social proof. And if you're trying to make the main page from the new page, which is kind of the process, you start with no social proof. So that's been my my hot take this week.
Wow, you heard it here first. Remove your cookie banners.
And remove the cookie. I mean, I'm not saying violate GDPR.
Sorry, yeah. Should clarify.
Yeah.
Do it by the book.
Because I looked at some of these sites like Fly.io, Supabase, like they just don't drop cookies if you land on the blog. So, and I changed. I tried it from a few different IPs and that sort of stuff. We also don't drop cookies. We use Plausible. So,
Amazing. That's a very good tip. Yeah, Paul. So if people want to learn more about yourself, or they want to learn more about drifting in space or browser tech, where can they learn more?
Yeah, so we write a newsletter on browser tech. It tends to be either a link digest or in weeks where I have something to say, it tends to be more commentary. So that is at digest.browsertech.com. Browsertech.com is also where we have our in-person events listed. The database I mentioned is DriftDB, so driftdb.com. Our site is We're Drifting in Space. It's drifting in drifting in one word, dot space. And then on Twitter, we're drifting_corp.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining, Paul, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jack.